All right, good morning. We are going to get started this morning. We are in the 17th chapter of Acts, if you want to get turning there. Before we get started this morning, I've asked Derek if he would lead us in a word of prayer before we start our class.
Father in heaven, as we come to you this morning, we're thankful for the night's rest that you've given us. Thankful for the safe travel to come here and that we can take this time to study your word and worship you, Father. Pray that you'll be with us as we go through this class and be with Dennis and give him a recollection of all the things that he studied to present this morning. Ask that we'll open our minds, our hearts, and look at this and see what we can learn from it, how we can apply it. Pray you'll be with all the teachers and the students here this morning. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right, so we are getting ready to go to Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens. Before we do that, where were we last week? Kind of catch us up. What have we done so far? We were in Philippi last week. We had Lydia, the Philippian jailer. Those are the stories we kind of remember. Last week was the opening of the second missionary journey, as it's typically called. So, as they left Philippi, that was the city where they were beginning to get ready to run them out of town. Paul raised hey, by the way, do you know we're Roman citizens? Everybody got really scared and then asked them really nicely to please leave town. They go from there to Thessalonica. This is one of the places where we see the switch from we to they. So it appears that Luke stayed in Philippi. And Paul, Barnabas, and Timothy went on to Thessalonica. I put this map up here. You can kind of see we have now, and actually just to kind of help you see it better, I also put this up here. If you look, they are down here, down in the corner. Athens is on that map. So they have entered Europe now. At this point, this is as far west as they have traveled. So they've gotten into Europe, and then back here is what it looks like as they were going. But that's where they have gotten to. So I want to make sure I actually keep up with my notes. We already talked a little bit about that. So he entered Thessalonica. What did Paul do when he entered Thessalonica? This is the one we can ask every week and answer it pretty much the same. Yeah.
He goes to the synagogue to preach.
He goes to the synagogue to preach. Yes. It says and let me find my notes here. Converted. There is a footnote on the bottom of page 102, the first footnote there that the author puts in the book, that Paul went, he says in the paragraph, arriving at Thessalonica, Paul went to the synagogue of the Jews. The footnote there mentions that he went to them where they were instead of waiting for them to come to us. He asked the question in the book, or basically makes the statement that sometimes we make the mistake of saying, well, we're here on Sunday and the doors are unlocked. My question is, though, how do we do this? I mean, we don't have a synagogue we can go to where all the God-fearing people are hanging out during the week. How do we take the gospel to the people as opposed to sitting in a building and being a little smug and thinking they can come to us if they want it? Because he made that point, and I thought it was a good point. But what does that look like practically?
I it could be as simple as something, like you and Kyle meet and do a Bible study at the Pancake
Yeah.
House here, and it's just being visible. It's being out in the open and saying, hey, there's two guys with the Bible. I mean, sometimes it strikes us when we see that out in public, and we've been out and seen people with their Bible and studying, and it's
Yeah.
just, it's almost an oddity at least sometimes. And
Yeah.
so you recognize it and you see it, but just being out and open like that kind of could open a door, because I think we live in a time where people have a lot of questions.
Yep.
And if you're there accessible to someone, then they might come to ask you.
Yeah.
And that's one way of taking it out.
Yeah, that's good. What else, Bob?
Obviously, one-on-one is a way to do that, but also, there's a number of denominations do it pretty well. Is they get in the car and they drive up and they knock on your door and say,
Yep.
would you like to talk about, now, we are not going to study with them because they're not going to study with us
Yeah.
long-term, but you've got to admire their grit or their determination
Yeah.
or their desire to go preach and teach, even though we would say they are teaching error. That's not the point of it.
Yeah.
The point of it is they have the nerve or the gumption or whatever you want to call it to leave their comfort zone and come to you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
As I think about the word used, especially the Greeks, they went to the mall.
Yeah.
They went to the marketplace. They went to people who were trading and doing business. And I was we did a thing for work. There was a Habitat for Humanity build. And, it's a faith-based organization. So there are ways that we can fulfill our personal responsibilities to help all men and give us opportunities to get in front of all men. And in a context where you're helping and they're attracted
Yep.
by the gospel.
That's a real good point. Like I said, I didn't have any really deep thoughts on that. Whenever I saw that, I thought that's a good question. What does that look like?
We saw Paul go to the water to meet with Lydia
Yeah.
and those there. So it was obviously known that someone met there and they were religious or orientation was there.
Yep.
And so he sought that out. He sought that information out and then followed through.
Yeah. Yep. Yep, that's good. That's kind of what I was thinking of. What we're, how do we do that? So Paul's preaching in the synagogue. What was the result? Again, it's kind of what we see every week. We can answer this the same. Go ahead.
Some Jews, many Greeks.
Yeah. Yeah, it says some believed, some didn't, and some got mad. And
Few of the leading women, which is
Yep.
different than
Yeah.
we've seen.
yeah, they seem to have, and I didn't actually, this is something that just came in my mind, and I didn't go back and look at this. As we get further from Jerusalem, are we seeing more of the Greeks who are perhaps less familiar with this? I don't know. I didn't look at that. That just entered my mind. I don't know that. So in verse 6, they were charged with something. This is one of these verses that we know. What were these men charged with by the Thessalonican mob?
He turned the world upside down.
Okay. Was that fair? What do you think? Had they turned the world upside down? Because I did exactly what Bob just did. I went, no, and then I thought, well, yeah, maybe,
Kinda.
yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I did whenever I thought about that. They really were. I mean, you think about how Christianity has changed the world. And they were in the process of doing that right then. They were changing everything. And we tend to don't think of that because we've all lived our entire life in a society where it's all around us. But they really were changing the world. Yep.
I think it's obvious from the way it reads that they were making changes and they were very well known, because it says, these who have turned the world upside down have come here too. So they obviously have heard that these men have been in other cities,
Yeah.
and they have been preaching this, and I would think especially among those who went to the synagogue,
Mm-hmm.
and then, it definitely their reputation had preceded.
Yeah. Yeah. David?
Just like in verse 7, that the second part of their accusation is the same that the Jews accused Jesus of, as Kyle talked about last week.
Yeah.
That they're saying there's another king, this Jesus.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I mean, that's another one that, well, I mean, yes, but also absolutely no, not what you're implying here is what they're saying.
Yeah. That was a really good charge to throw at them, but you doubt the men who said it even really believed it. They understood they're not advocating revolt here.
Yeah, the only revolting people are the Jews that are
Yeah.
attacking them.
Yeah, that are attacking them, that are mobs. Yeah. That's the question I just asked. So, go ahead.
It's just, one of the things that stands out here, and this is the same thing during Christ's time, these men are envious. Their preeminence that they feel in the synagogue, et cetera, is being threatened because
Yep.
of this teaching. And that's really, where that's coming from. They're just using that as an excuse to back up their jealousy.
Yeah. Yeah. This is, and to be fair, no one likes change. And these men were changing things a lot. So they leave there and they go where? Berea. And I tried to find a decent background picture of the city of Berea, but Berea is still a city, so they've rebuilt everything. So it doesn't look like ancient Berea. That's the hillside outside of Berea. I thought about sneaking in a picture of Berea, Kentucky, but I thought I should do that. I can see if anybody noticed.
It'd be a little greener.
Yeah. So they go to Berea. Why do we remember the Bereans? Why do we have a Berea, Kentucky, and little churches out in the country called the Berean whatever?
They search the scriptures daily.
Yep.
They're infamous for that, really.
Yes, they were more noble. So they were more noble because they searched the scriptures daily. What was the result of this?
Many believed.
Yeah, it says many believed. This is the point, and I have made this point I don't know how many times, especially in high school classes. Why was it so important that the Bereans were searching the scriptures to see if these things were true? Why does that make them more noble?
There's an expectation we process these arguments and we think through them, that we find that they are present in the scriptures for us,
Yeah.
not because you said so or somebody else said so.
Yes. Ron?
In verse 11, it says that they were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica.
Yeah, they were more fair-minded. I've told our high schoolers again and again, no one is going to get to stand before God in the day of judgment and say, well, I didn't know any better, that's what the preacher said. We don't get to do that. You don't get to stand before God in the day of judgment and say, well, I didn't know that was wrong, Mom and Dad thought it was okay. God does not allow us to be ignorant. It's maybe the best way to say it. We have to search, we have to find it out, we have to know it ourselves, I guess would be the way to say it.
We're told study to show yourself approved.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, it seems everything is going really well in Berea until men from Thessalonica show up. Why would they have bothered to go to the next town? I mean, they've already ran them out of their city.
You have to think about it. I've thought this before. Like, no one in the first century had anything better to do than to harass people that followed them along. But you think these are major trading routes. This is the Ignatian Way.
Yep.
Not to mention, you go further east, and they're following major trading routes. So these
Yep.
people are in business too, and
Yep.
it's very likely that these are, as they travel town to town, doing their business, that they are bringing news of, hey, you know, the snake oil salesman was in the last town
Yep.
causing a ruckus, and they, you know,
Yep.
and it follows them that way. I don't know. It's speculation to say that
Yeah.
it's that, or are they maliciously following them?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Bob?
They don't want to go nearby and have it established.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think
Yep.
about it, it's like if we are fighting something, we don't want somebody to come into Pittsburgh
Yep.
and be successful at what we're fighting.
Yeah. That's what I thought of. Do false teachers ever stop at one congregation? Yeah. We don't get to say, well, that's happening over there, it doesn't affect us. Right? And there are congregations, I am sure, that have attempted that in the past. That's not happening here, so we're not going to worry about it. We don't have to talk about that because that's not a problem here. That gets you in a ton of trouble. And we see the same thing in the first century. False teachers didn't stay put. So the false teachers show up. How does this end up in Berea? Again, kind of the same question we could ask all the time, or answer it the same way. They stir up a riot. They leave. It appears that at this point, what they did was they got Paul out of town. We assume that was probably because he was the most vocal. It was kind of a, hey, look, we got him out of here. They're not going to try and kill Paul again. So Paul goes to where? Athens. Yes. Athens is the big deal now. Athens was a city of, I put in my notes, Athens was a city of big ideas. Athens is the city where we typically say democracy was born. You talk about ideas that turned the world upside down. Athens could lay claim to that, okay? Athens is where Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all lived. It was where the Olympics Games started. Athens was a college town in the best sense of that word. It was a town of thinkers. So Paul shows up here in Athens, all right? He immediately goes where? He goes to the synagogue again. So he's going to the synagogue, he's speaking to the Jews, but he's also somewhere else too. The marketplace. So he's talking in the marketplace. What does the brain trust of Athens seem to think of Paul? What word do they use? This is interesting.
It says the babbler.
They call him a babbler. That word is really interesting because what that is, and we don't use that word, but this is the guy who has read a book about airplanes and wants to tell Brad and Derek all about airline maintenance because I read a book once. You know, that kind of person. I watch Chicago Fire, so I get to tell Kendrick what it means to be a firefighter. That's kind of the idea here. They're saying, you've picked up some of the right words, and now you're sounding like a philosopher, but you don't really know what you're talking about, is how they make fun of him, or how they mock him. So what did they decide they were going to do?
Good audience, the Areopagus.
Yeah, we're going to go to the Areopagus. We're going to go to the place where these big ideas are discussed, and you're going to come and you're going to tell us about your big ideas. Okay? So they go there. How does Paul open up the discussion? What does he start with?
He pokes the bear.
Okay.
He says, I perceive that in every way you're very religious.
Mm-hmm.
He goes on to say, you even have a monument to the unknown God.
Yes.
So you're way over the top.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the first line there are different views on that. There are some who take that in all ways you are very religious as, like you said, poking the bear. There are others who look at that and say he was complimenting them when he said that. Again, we don't know. That a lot of that probably comes down to tone. But he talks about the unknown God. This is where this gets really interesting, and this is something that I did not know. Let me see here. Well, first of all, what does he tell them about the unknown God? He says, I'm going to tell you about this unknown God. He made the world. On page 104 of your book, our author makes a real good point there. It says the living God. Said he made 3 points. God made the world. He's the ruler of heaven and earth. And he doesn't dwell in temples made by man. 3 things about this unknown God that would have been very different to their ears. Okay? They knew where their gods lived. They lived on Mount Olympus. So this would have been very different to their Grecian ears. And actually, I wrote 3, there's 4, because the final point is he doesn't depend upon man for his existence.
Right.
This is where it gets interesting. He then quotes Epimenides. Epimenides is an interesting guy, and this is a part I did not get. Epimenides is actually known for 3 things. He would have been a prophet, philosopher, seer from like the 4th century BC. So we're talking roughly the time of like Malachi, and that's very roughly. He is remembered for 3 things. 1, he supposedly fell asleep in a cave for 57 years and woke up as a prophet. Okay? That was kind of his origin story. Secondly, he is known for what's known as the Cretan paradox. That comes from this quote right here, which Paul quotes in Titus. That second line there where it says, Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. That's what Paul quotes in the book of Titus. The reason it's known as the Cretan paradox is because Epimenides was from Crete. So when he says that all Cretans are always liars, is he lying because he's from Crete? This also gives you an idea of what philosophers like to do all day. This was the kind of stuff they thought about. Okay? Now, what Paul quotes here is, of course, the last line. But here's what's really interesting. The third thing that Epimenides is known for is the purification of Athens. Near the end of Epimenides' life, the city of Athens had a pestilence, a plague, we would say. They call Epimenides to come and fix it because he's some kind of holy prophet seer guy, right? He comes to the city, goes up on the Areopagus, right where Paul is standing, and lets loose, I believe it was 30 sheep. He tells them, follow these sheep, wherever they lay down at, you build an altar and you sacrifice them. Of course, the answer is, who do we sacrifice them to? Epimenides says, I don't know, you sacrifice them to an unknown God. Epimenides was the reason why you had statues in Athens to an unknown God. I thought that was really kind of cool. I'd never heard that before. So when Paul pulls out this quote, they would have got it. They would have understood that he was telling them about the God that Epimenides was talking about all those years before, that was legendary among them. So he goes through that. It appears like everything is going really, really well. And then he gets to the end of verse 31. And verse 31 says, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man who he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Verse 32 says, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So Paul went out, and then some followed him. My question is, why didn't Paul stop before he got to the resurrection of the dead? Because it seemed like everything was going really well up till then. Why add the part that they didn't like? Yeah, it's important.
If you're preaching Christ, you can't ignore the resurrection.
Yes. Yes. What?
It all stands or falls on the resurrection.
Yep. The reason I ask this is, how many of you in this room have heard somebody say, oh, I hope he doesn't say that. We might have visitors today. You can't say that. You'll just make people mad and they won't ever come back again. Do we get to temper God's word? Now, there is some wisdom in how you say things. I understand that. But do we get to leave parts out because it might offend somebody? Do we get to say, we're not going to say that because what if we have a guest and it offends them and they never come in the door again? It doesn't appear that Paul's worry was, I might say something they don't like. And I think we live in a world where we are probably overly careful not to do that at times. Okay. Any comments on that before I go on? Yes.
It makes me think of that statement made to Timothy, be instant in season and out of season. We know that there are things that are unpopular, but that doesn't mean you shy away from them.
Yeah. Yeah. I've always heard that passage explained, you do it when it's easy and you do it when it's hard. And years ago, just because I've never done it, I asked I said, what are the out of season things? What are the hard parts? And he immediately went to removing fellowship. He said, those are never sermons that any preacher ever wants to preach because they're not fun. Those aren't the easy ones. And we could sit here and come up with a handful of them that are like that. Those are the slides I had. I wanted to leave a little bit of time to look at the questions. Before we start going through them, are there any of them that you really particularly like that you want to talk about first so we make sure we get to them? I don't want to skip a question if somebody thought, ooh, that was really a good one. Nope, okay. So we talked about, in the progress report, I guess the first question there, our author kind of does this each week of the progress report. We've really kind of talked about that. It seems to be the same thing every week. There's this, some believed, some didn't, some got very, very angry. Do we see that today? Do we see the same three basic responses to the gospel?
I think people get angry quietly.
Okay. We tend to not have mobs, yeah.
But it's not unheard of for a response to be angry.
Okay, so why? Why is it that the gospel, I can understand someone who says, I don't believe that, or I don't think you're right, or whatever excuse someone might give. Why would the gospel make someone angry?
I think it goes kind of along like what we were talking about at the beginning, where they were accused of flipping the world upside down. For some people that we talk to, like, that have never heard the gospel or heard a different gospel, so to speak, they think their truth is their truth. Kind of that line of thinking, for some of them, you are flipping their world completely upside down, or causing them to, in the case of Athens, and I thought that was really, really good. I was kind of curious. I was like, man, why Athens? When I was reading last night, why is that such a difficult place? That was a good point about, like, this is a place of just different thinking, like very open, optimistic. Well, what about this? What about that? Is it really this? Is it really that?
Yeah.
That is more so throughout, especially in the United States, throughout the country. So you're kind of saying, well, no, this is tried and true, this is the direction, and it's the same it's always been, and you're trying to tell people, you know, a group of people that are like, well, no, nothing is the way it's always been.
Yeah.
We have TV, we have technology, we have this, it's not the same.
Yeah.
So you're changing the world.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. That's a real good point. I think sometimes people don't like it if you tell them they're wrong. Do you have something here?
The gospel's convicting.
Okay.
So, yeah, and just to your point, you know, people, if it convicts you and you're in the wrong, well, people tend to get upset about it.
Yeah.
You mentioned this at the very start of the class, change is hard.
Yeah.
And if you're actually convicted, as Derek just mentioned, if you're actually convicted, you look at your life and you see all the things you have to change. You may have to change your career, you may have to change any number of things, your circle of friends, et cetera. And that's hard.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a real good point. And actually, when you said that, I thought, just because sometimes I find myself doing this, as someone who, quote unquote, grew up in the church, I forget sometimes that people have to do that. That everything is different for them now, and probably need to be better at remembering that. Yeah. Todd, did you have something?
No.
Oh, okay. You were just waving, okay.
Yes,
So yeah, sometimes the gospel can make people angry. Let me get something here. Did I have? No. We talked about how do we take gospel to the people, expecting them to come to us. We talked about that already. In Thessalonica, it says that he reasoned with them from the scriptures. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we do that? Or how do I do it better? How do we reason with people from the scriptures?
He had to fix their view of the Messiah based on what the Bible actually said about the Messiah.
Okay.
They believed the Messiah would, be the one who takes them out of Roman rule, but he had to show them that the scriptures actually say the Messiah would suffer. And he had to actually show that that was the case. So again, there's some assumptions in there for us too. There's an expectation that we can't reason. That we actually have to put thoughts together as we process and even as we teach. But we need to show the gospel is what it is, not what you want it to be.
Yep, that's good. Sort of the idea, it goes back to what we said earlier. You don't get to tell someone this is the truth, you believe it. Just sit there in the pew and be quiet and do what I tell you to. That's never what it looked like to teach someone. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, what is the standard also? There has to be some point of a standard where we can get our information from or derive everything from, and when you don't have that, then we get into okay, well, I think this, well, I think this, it's kind of funny, like Ryan always says, he jokingly, he's like, well, it's not Ryan's thoughts, it's what's in the Bible, so let's start there, he says that in a jokingly but serious manner, and that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
What is the standard? This is where we're going to start from, and then we reason from the standard, not reason from
Yeah. And that's one of as I was thinking about this, I thought that's one of the cool things when you teach the little kids, or even the older kids. You see that point where it quits becoming about memorizing the books of the Bible, and they start to get it. And that is one of those incredibly cool things that when you teach, you get to see. And it may happen once a quarter with somebody in the room, but when it does, it is so cool. When you see the dots connect, and it's working, they understand it. Because, well, again, we're not called to obey blindly. We're called to understand. It's good. We didn't really talk about Jason. They attacked Jason. Most people seem to think Jason was probably the head of the synagogue. We don't know that. I believe it says he lived next to a synagogue. Okay, maybe I'm misreading that. Maybe I've got my thoughts confused because it does not say that here. Okay, you may have to disregard what I just said because I was saying that. But anyway, they dragged Jason out. He was one of the believers. Our author talks a little bit about the idea that it sounds a lot like he just posted bail. You know, either he posted bail or he bribed them enough to let him go. And they got Paul out of town. So, again, we talked about turning the world upside down. I think we actually covered a lot of these. I'm going to run out of stuff to talk about here before we get done. Search the scriptures. Okay, let's go back and actually talk a little bit more about Paul's sermon. Question A, he asked, how would you summarize it? What exactly did Paul tell them? What was his, so to say, what was his point, or where was he going with this? What was he trying to lead them to?
He was trying to change their view from polytheistic to monotheistic.
Yeah.
So trying to show them, you've got all of these gods that are each individual thing, but they're stone.
Yeah.
And there's the one God, the true God, that you have labeled the unknown God, who created life, who created reason, who gave us everything we have, and then gave us salvation from ourselves.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You know, I thought about the comment that I said where he was poking the bear, and you said some of the people take other ways. You might take it to mean he was trying to establish some commonality with them,
Yeah.
saying, I see you're serious about your religion.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I see that you are sincere
Mhm.
in trying to understand who you're supposed to worship. Let me explain to you the truth about who you're supposed to worship.
Yeah.
Maybe I can see that.
Yeah. And there is also a bit here of knowing your audience. This is probably a very different sermon than what was preached in the jailer's house last week in Philippi. He knew his crowd. It also, I saw a couple people who pointed out, it points to the fact that Paul would have had a very high-end education. He could quote Epimenides, he could quote Artaxerxes. The second one is a quote from a astronomy poem. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and you get, Greek astronomy poems, that's where you want to go.
Yeah, agreeing with David's point that he's trying to get them to monotheism, but I find it interesting as I look at that, he doesn't kick all their gods.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, he says, if this God made everything and you're his children, and you're not like wood or stone or gold, right? He doesn't have to say, your gods are stupid.
Yeah.
If I can show you that this God made everything, what does that leave?
Yeah.
But he lets them reason themselves to that by teaching about the one true God. There are some things as we address them, we address what the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
I don't need to go understand all the things the Bible doesn't teach that man has made up. If I can simply focus on what it says, you'll make the conclusions that, oh wow, that must not be right.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes we make the mistake of trying to delve into every false doctrine there is and convince them that's wrong instead of just saying this is what the Bible says. That's a good point. It's a real good point. What was I going to say? Yes.
I was gonna say, when I listen to or read that speech, one thing I always think of is his speech was a success. He didn't expect to go in there and win all those people, but he did expect to explain some stuff, and he did actually get a few people who wanted to hear him.
Yeah.
So was it successful? Yeah, I'd say it was.
That's a good point. Do we judge success by how many people come forward at the end of a sermon? We can fall into that trap, can't we? Brother so-and-so who's baptized so many people. Paul's point wasn't how many people can I get baptized. Paul's point was the truth taught. That's a good point.
The other thing you had asked about, why do people get so angry? I mean, you'll get to a point with somebody where you're talking and they understand what you're saying, and then the question becomes, so am I going to hell because I?
Yeah.
Or is my mom going to hell because she? And,
Yeah.
and again, it's making that personal application that really ticks people off. The one I think about is false religions. Think about these religions that have existed forever. Paul addresses here. Times of ignorance, the times of worshiping all these gods, that's over. What made it over? Because the resurrection was such an apparent thing and proven to all men, there is no excuse now that you can claim some other deity. And so the resurrection was the thing that flipped the switch between maybe whatever reasons God allowed those things, but now the expectation is there is a truth. It was so evident that you should know the truth and follow it.
That's good, and I'm glad you said that because that was one of the things I did want to get to. I marked this question. Question number 9. What does it mean when he says that the times of ignorance God winked at? Were there times when it was okay to be ignorant of God? He says there were. What does that mean? What does he mean there? I have a note going to, let me get back here. Romans, see if my note actually applies to what I wrote down here. Romans 2:14 and 15. In Romans 2:14 and 15, he's talking about the old law. And he said, when Gentiles who did not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Is this what Paul's talking about? Yeah. The example I found someone put, and I thought this was kind of a good way, at least for me to understand it. Think about the city of Nineveh. When the city of Nineveh repented, did they all have to become Jews for God to save them? And God decided he's not going to destroy the city? No, they had to change. So back to Corey's point, there was this point when Jesus walked out of that tomb when everything changed.
In Acts 14, I think he says it more simply. In the generations gone by, in verse 16, in the generations gone by, he permitted nations to go their own way. And yet, he did not leave them without witness. He did good, he gave you rains. Again, we have creation, and then the resurrection of eternity. So again, it's the same concept.
Yep.
You overlook times of ignorance. He let nations do their own things, they had their own gods, because he knew not everybody was a Jew. He revealed his will, his word to a special people. What's that mean for all the rest?
Yeah. And it's interesting when you think about it. Think about who Paul is talking to here again. He's talking to a group of people who pride themselves on being deep thinkers. These are people who are pondering things like, why does the world exist when the gods we believe in don't seem like they can create stuff? Why do, is there more there? These are people who were trying to, the other guy that's quoted, I can't say his name, I didn't look it up. Artaxerxes, he is the one that gave us the Greek names for the constellations. So these are big thinkers. And Paul's giving them a big idea. There is something different than any God you have studied or realized or thought about. They would have been, and I did probably too much digging into the philosopher stuff, but when it talks about the Stoics, they would have been what we would have thought of today as deists. They were very much, there's something out there, it probably created everything, but it doesn't really do anything anymore. The Epicureans tended to lead more towards, there's not much out there. But these were people, and I'll leave you with this thought. Well, actually, no, I won't. Does anyone have a last word they want to throw out? I'll let you talk instead of me. I've talked too much.
I think, I hadn't paid attention to this, but if you look at verse 31 there at the end, you asked earlier, did he have to preach the resurrection of the dead? And I think the answer is yes, because he says here, the assurance was given to all by raising him from the dead. So that's the proof text
Yeah.
of why we're here, why we're talking about this,
Yeah.
what we can do, and how we can be saved.
Yeah. The proof is he walked out of that grave. And at this time, if you wanted to, you still could have found somebody who'd seen him after that. You know, you still could have found a person who said, yeah, I was there, I saw him. So yeah, thank you all for your help. Good class.